Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pentateuch, and you can see we are in front of the Marble Palace, the Supreme Court of the United States in our nation's beautiful capital. Indeed, it's a beautiful day here. We'll talk about why we're here in just a moment, but today we're going to talk about the first half of the book of Genesis. This is a general overview, trying to familiarize us with what all is going on in this book as a whole. Let's look at our agenda for today. First, we're going to take a look at the book of Genesis as an overview, and indeed try to assign an idea of what all is this book about, again, as a coherent whole. I'm always going to emphasize that point. What does each of these 5 books of the Pentateuch mean taken as a whole? Because keep in mind, that's how it was written. Later, people divided it into chapters and verses and choose out different pericopes to read on their own. But the book was accepted by Israel and then by the church as an organic whole. Indeed, the church received these 5 books as the Law of Moses, as a coherent whole, a coherent 5-book unit. Then we're going to do a synchronic survey. We're going to look a little more closely at what's happening in the first half of the book of Genesis, and then we're going to pull out a few major theological points. So let's do this general overview. The book of Genesis consists of 4 main parts. We've talked about cycles. A cycle is a collection of narratives that center around one character or theme. There are 4 main cycles in Genesis, and a number of authors have come to the same conclusion, even if they dither over which chapters, what are the precise contours of each one. There are 4 cycles. There's the permeable cycle, dealing with prehistory. Then we move to the Abraham cycle. As the name implies, Abraham is the main character. And we're going to hear how Abraham goes from Mesopotamia to Syro-Palestine, to what's eventually the Holy Land, then to Egypt, then back to Syro-Palestine. He moves around our 3 main ecosystems we've already talked about in this course. Then we're going to move to the Jacob cycle, and then we conclude with the Joseph cycle. The book concludes with Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, indeed Jacob's favorite son, finding his way to Egypt, all of which tells us why the people of Israel are in Egypt to be enslaved by a later pharaoh, ultimately paving the way for the Exodus. What's interesting, and I'm drawing on John Goldingay's recent commentary on Genesis, it was just published a few months ago, he tells us that each of these 3 cycles gives us 2 attributes of God. In the permeable cycle, God is disciplinary, yet merciful. In the Abraham cycle, he's promissory, that is, he makes promises, yet still demanding. In the Jacob cycle, God is accommodating. Jacob, as we're going to see, is something of a sinister fellow. He's not the most sympathetic character, at least among the patriarchs. Yet God is also persistent. God works with him. And then in the Joseph cycle, God is proactive, yet interactive. All of this contributes to that macro theme we've already talked about in Genesis, and indeed the whole Pentateuch, that Israel is telling its vocation story. It's telling the story of its relationship with its God, and how God, against all sorts of odds, has led his people to the present day. God chose this people and protected them even when they were in danger. Again and again, we're going to see danger and God delivering the patriarchs and the early people from these dangers. This brings us to our synchronic survey. Let's zero in now on the permeable and Abraham cycles. First, the permeable cycle. As you can see here, after the opening 3 chapters, which focus on creation and the origins of both marriage and then sin, in chapters 4 through 11, a lot of bad things happen. We have the origins of murder, the origin of polygamy, the origin in chapter 9 of drunkenness, and in chapter 11, the origin of the different and confused human languages. We also hear about the flood and how the rainbow begins and how God destroys and then rebuilds creation in the aftermath of the flood. We also hear where the surrounding nations come from, and that's going to be most interesting. We'll say more about that in the theology section. And we have these toledot formulae in chapters 5 and 11. A toledot is a list of generations. Indeed, that noun toledot in Hebrew comes from the same word that means boy. It describes a young boy, a child born, so it's the list of the subsequent sons. We'll see these marking Genesis regularly. They're a key structuring device within the book. Then we move to the Abraham cycle, and I want to call your attention to the 2 things you see highlighted on your screen. They're not the most famous parts of the Abraham cycle, but there are two specific episodes where Abraham has Sarah pretend to be his sister rather than his wife. Abraham does this to save his life. He knows that Sarah is very beautiful and that she may be taken captive and Abraham killed if these more powerful people lay eyes on her. Let's look at chapter 12 and see how this takes place. When he, being Abraham, was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know that you are a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'She is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but let you live. Please say therefore that you are my sister, so that I may fare well on your account, and my life may be spared for your sake." Notice once again, God delivers Abraham and his successive generations from long odds. And this theme repeats itself again and again in the Abraham cycle. Not only does God lead Abraham through all these different places in the ancient Near East, he promises that he will have a natural child with Sarah. But there's some hijinks along the way. Abraham, of course, fathers a son with Hagar, Ishmael, who eventually gets banished from the house. After the institution of circumcision, these three mysterious visitors come to Abraham and Sarah on a hot day. Abraham welcomes them extravagantly, and they promise Abraham a son. Then these mysterious visitors go to visit Lot, Abraham's nephew, who is Abraham's foil in this part of the narrative. Lot does not welcome them nearly as well as Abraham does, and the people with Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah do exactly what one ought not do when welcoming mysterious visitors, and they pay quite a consequence for that. Long story short, Sodom and Gomorrah get death, Abraham gets life. Incidentally, Isaac is largely a flat character in the book of Genesis. Stuff happens to him. He's not usually the protagonist. Notably, his life is relatively free from drama because he only takes one wife, Rebekah. We'll talk about what happens next in our next class when we talk about Jacob and Joseph. But I want to move now to the theology of this section of Genesis, and I want to call your attention to three main elements. One is that Genesis is not just about Israel's origins, it's also about the origins of the surrounding nations. As you can see, most of these nations have ignominious origins. You can see at the top of your list, Canaan, Egypt, Assyria, Philistia, all are related to Ham, one of the sons of Noah, the cursed son of Noah. Ham looks upon his father's nakedness after Noah gets drunk. This is after the flood. And Ham's descendants are cursed, most notably Canaan. And that's important because Canaan is going to be the group of people that occupies the promised land before Israel comes in. Indeed, we read in Genesis 9, when Noah woke from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Indeed, you can see in the blue highlights in the Hebrew text, it literally means slave of slaves. So Canaan is this slave of slaves. This makes present Israel's understanding of how it has been chosen over and against these threatening enemies that they face in their subsequent history. I need to pause and move to our second theological element to point out that this passage in Genesis 9 has been among the most misinterpreted in history with catastrophic results. As you can see, while Egypt is in Africa and is a descendant of Ham, many of the other nations, including Assyria and Philistia and Canaan, are not set on the African continent. Yet, for many centuries, slavery and then later segregation in this country were justified by Christians as a natural consequence of the sin of Ham. This legacy remains with us today. I want to call your attention to a Supreme Court decision. This is why we're at the U.S. Supreme Court here. This was a Supreme Court decision from January 2018, very, very recent. This was a death penalty case, and this deals with an inmate named Tharp who's appealing his death sentence. Note what the opinion says. Tharp, a condemned inmate challenging his murder conviction, produced a sworn affidavit signed by Gaddy, a juror at Tharp's trial, indicating Gaddy's view that there are two types of black people, black folks and a word I'm not going to use, and that after studying the Bible, I have wondered if black people even have souls. This is truly a scandal. A third major theological theme, the use of the verb bana in Hebrew, the verb to build. Very simple in Genesis. Good people build altars, bad people build cities. These nomadic, much poorer people are mocking their Assyrian and Babylonian and Egyptian overlords. This is a really interesting book. I look forward to talking about the second half of it with you in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.